Welcome everyone to week number 6. We are headed to the end of this term now. So let's see what we've got going on. Oh, by the way, this is one of my favorite pictures from this past year. I went out to a sunflower field and happened to catch this swallowtail butterfly on a sunflower along with a bumblebee. Okay, so let's talk about what you learned last week, and that was about the structure of DNA and how it replicates or makes a copy of itself. Mitosis, which is a type of nuclear division where the chromosomes separate from each other when cell division is about to take place. We learned about checkpoints and cancer and the cell cycle. All of that was really important. And then you also learned about the job of DNA, which is to make proteins, and that is transcription, where DNA, a small portion of DNA, is used to make a small molecule, a messenger RNA, which is then used to make a protein. So that is called translation when you go from RNA to protein. All right, this week you're going to learn about meiosis, which is another type of cellular division, but it's where more division happens between the chromosomes, and this happens when sex cells or gametes are being produced, because you have to have half the number of chromosomes because you have the combination of an egg and a sperm that come together. So you have to have half the normal number of chromosomes in an egg, half in the sperm, so that you have the correct number when these two fuse and you make a gamete. So that's meiosis. And then in chapter 12, it's all about Mendelian genetics and inheritance patterns, which is really cool. I'll talk about that again in a minute. Dominant recessive traits. And Mendel figured that out way back in the 1800s. He was an Austrian monk, and he didn't have a heck of a lot to do besides study science. And he was interested in genetics, so he studied pea plants, and he came up with this idea of dominant and recessive traits and how the traits are passed down through generations. So that's a really interesting chapter, and if you're doing the lab, you're also doing that this week when you're growing your fast plants. Then you also need to take a look at chapter 47, which is all about biodiversity on a genetic level, on a species level, on an ecosystem level, and why it is so important. We're going to talk about this again in a second. All right, read the Module 6 overview and watch the videos. There's a video on meiosis, which explains that and how you end up with half the number of chromosomes in a sex cell. And you'll also watch a video on epigenetics, which I will talk about in this video. Epigenetics is the control of genes and how they are expressed. And it's very interesting because you see a little skinny brown mouse and a kind of chunky white mouse, and they are identical twins, but they definitely don't look alike. So how in the world could that be? You're going to find out in that video, which leads us to the 2 assignments that you have due this week. Discussion board postings, initial is due on Thursday, and the 2 response posts are due on Sunday evening. You're going to discuss that video on epigenetics and how those 2 mice can look so different from each other yet be identical twins, meaning they have exactly the same genetics. Yeah, so we're going to talk about epigenetics in a second. And then you're also going to talk about how much nature and how much nurture contributes to making you an individual, whether you're a bacterium, a redwood tree, a mushroom, or a human being. So we're going to talk some more about that in just a second. Your journal entry, so you got the discussion board postings, and then you have a journal entry, and it is kind of long, so don't worry if you go over the word count. I'm just saying you need to answer the questions thoroughly. There are a lot of questions in this, so it will help you to get a little sticky note and write down everything that you have to answer, because there are a lot of questions this week. One of the first question is, how do bacteria reproduce? And this is a process called binary fission, where the cells just split in half. But of course, it's a very organized way that the cell splits in half. And I'm giving you a chapter here. Chapter 22, Section 2 will explain this process to you, and it will also explain to you how bacteria get new traits. Because the mother cell just divides in half, that mother cell makes identical daughter cells. So here's the issue with bacteria. If they're identical to the original cell, then how in the world can you have any variety in a population of bacteria? Well, bacteria have strategies to do this. First of all, mutations. Mutations happen, and they can cause their own mutations to occur by releasing hydrogen peroxide inside their own cells. That's one way that they cause mutations. This gives them survival advantage when they are under stress. But also there are three other processes. Conjugation, which is a transfer of plasmids, a little piece of DNA between cells. Transformation, where cells just pick up DNA from the environment. And transduction, where bacterial viruses, called bacteriophages, transfer DNA from one bacterium to another. So that is explained in Chapter 22, Section 2. So do take a look at that. You're going to discuss advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. That is without sex involved. That's what bacteria do. You're also going to discuss how meiosis leads to sexual reproduction, what's involved there, and advantages and disadvantages to sexual reproduction. And I will discuss that in an upcoming slide in just a second. And how does sexual reproduction lead to a tremendous amount of biodiversity on a genetic level, but also species-wise, etc. So if you talk about biodiversity, you also need a good definition of evolution, because biodiversity is important for evolution. Evolution is a change in genes in a population over time. You've got to have a very diverse population, gene-wise especially, in order to overcome any kind of stressor that's in the environment. And when you have a particular stressor, say in bacteria, their environment is heating up. It is getting warmer and warmer to the point where this particular species of bacteria couldn't survive. There has to be some genetic diversity, biodiversity, in this population of bacteria so that at least a few individuals can survive. A change in genes in a population over time. So in order for evolution to take place, you have to have diversity. Okay? You're also going to discuss genetic erosion in agriculture. So we have different species and subspecies of cattle and chickens and turkeys and potatoes and bananas and corn and, all kinds of crops, all kinds of livestock. We have different subspecies of these, like an Angus cow or a Jersey cow, or you get the idea. So we are saying that now we are losing a lot of these subspecies because of industrial farming. If you raise cattle, you only want to grow one particular type of cattle because you can suit your whole environment around that subspecies of cattle, that variety. This is also true with growing crops. In fact, in the world, there is one major subspecies of bananas that is being grown all around the world because they're the easiest to ship, they're sweet, they last a long time. But that is a problem because we're not growing all the other varieties of bananas. And what happens if a disease comes along that particular subspecies is susceptible to? And in fact, that is what's happening with the banana situation right now. There's a fungal infection that may wipe out all of the banana production across the world because we are only growing that one subspecies. So, is there genetic erosion in agriculture, and what can we do to stop this? And one idea to think about is maintaining heirloom varieties. You can buy heirloom varieties of tomatoes, for example, if you look at the right seed companies. And there are also things like seed banks that are available that are being used right now to maintain seeds of all different types of plants and varieties so that we don't lose them to what? Genetic erosion. Okay, and then you also want to work on your slides for your final project. So your final project is due in week number 7. This is week number 6, but by the time, well, partially through this week, I will have that 3rd milestone graded, and you will have all 3 of your milestones graded that go together to make up your final project. You will use all 3 of these milestones, every single part from the introduction and the topic, where, how, who, all of that, the biology, which is in the 2nd milestone, and the solutions, etc., in the 3rd milestone. You're going to put all of that together in slide format with speaker's notes on every slide in order to make a final project. I will talk about this more next week to make sure that you get it all together correctly, but you should be working on that this week also so that it doesn't just slam you in week number 7. Because, of course, if you're taking other courses, you have a lot due in week 7 in those courses too. So work on your slides, please, for the final project this week. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about some of these topics that I have mentioned so far. So, genes. When we talk about genes, what are they? Genes are little pieces of DNA that code for particular traits. This usually means the production of a specific protein, okay? That's what a gene is. But just think, genes equal traits. So genes are pieces of DNA that equal traits. And so right here, I give you 2 different ways that genes are inherited recessively or dominantly, and I give you some examples here. Albinism is a type of recessive trait, which you see in the lower left picture, where this boy doesn't have any melanin production, and so his skin, hair, eyes are all light colored. This is a recessive trait. The example in the middle, where this fellow is really super tall, that is called Marfan syndrome. And Marfan syndrome is inherited as a dominant trait. And so if one parent has one of these traits, the offspring will have it. So the person who has Marfan syndrome has a very tall stature and very large feet, very large hands. A lot of the time you will see people with Marfan syndrome being basketball players because you can see the advantage to this. But they also have a lot of health problems because, as you can imagine, if you grow very, very tall, you're going to have issues with your skeleton, with your muscles. They have a lot of back issues, a lot of problems with their legs. Also, there is another very devastating effect that Marfan syndrome can have, and that is a weakening of the aorta. The aorta is the major blood vessel that runs out of your heart and carries oxygenated blood throughout your whole body. So if a tear occurs in that, none of your tissues in your body can be oxygenated, and that is devastating. If that tear occurs, even if you're on the operating table, there's a great chance that you will not survive that. So that's a devastating symptom of Marfan syndrome. And then finally, we have sickle cell anemia down there on the right, and those are red blood cells. So normally red blood cells are that sort of Werther's lozenge sort of shaped cell down there, the nice little oval with a dip in the middle. That's what a red blood cell is supposed to look like. If you have sickle cell anemia, under low oxygen conditions, your red blood cells can sickle out and make those sharp little edges like you see in some of those red blood cells. This is a problem because they're supposed to be nice and oval shaped, nice and smooth. and that helps them travel through all the capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in the body, and they are just wide enough for one single red blood cell to travel through. If your red blood cells sickle like this, they get stuck. There are traffic jams of the red blood cells in the capillaries, and that means these particular tissues aren't getting oxygenated, and this causes tissue damage. That's why sickle cell anemia is so devastating, because tissues all around the body can be deprived of oxygen and then die. That's a recessive trait, sickle cell anemia. So there's just different examples of how traits are inherited. And there are lots of other ways. There are so many different sex-linked disorders and conditions, incomplete dominance, etc. There are just lots of different ways that inheritance patterns occur. Okay, for a second in here, I want to talk about nature versus nurture. So when we're talking about what determines who you are as an organism, is it nature, which means your genetic makeup, or is it nurture? Is it your environment that shapes who you are as a being? And this has been a very big debate for a very long time. Over 100 years now in science, but also in society. We've had some very horrible examples of this through time. The people who proposed that nature is more important than nurture ended up being a subset of people who believed in eugenics, true genetics. That's what that means. And they took it way too far in different countries across the world, including the United States of America, where we thought that if we could cull the bad traits in human beings, if we could remove those from the population, we would have a stronger human population. So there have been certain countries around the world, like Germany in World War II, where different subgroups of people, including gypsies and homosexuals and Jewish people and people with any kind of disability, were either sterilized or killed in order to help the human population be better and stronger. Now, we can say, the Holocaust was a horrible time, which of course it was. So many people were killed. Over 6 million people were killed because of eugenics. But eugenics was popular in the United States too, and we have to remember that. There were different states around the country that forced sterilization upon people. People who were alcoholics, people who were promiscuous, mentally ill, disabled. Yes, we did. We forced sterilization upon different populations of people, even as late as, I would say, the 1970s. So that's happened all around the country, which is amazing. So that's the nature side of it. What about nurture? How much does your environment contribute to the person that you are, but the organism that you are? If you remember, I said this occurs in bacteria and fungi and plants and other animals besides us. We all know that if there's stress, if there's abuse in your life, this can change you as a person. So there's the environmental stressor, there's the environmental effect on you as a being. How much does that contribute to you as a being? Even in utero, can that affect you? Can stress on a mother's body affect you as an individual when you are born? So that's a good debate that we still are having to this day, because we don't understand how much of each of these contributes to making us and making organisms what they are. So this is there for you to debate this week. I will post a link to identical twins who are separated at birth, two women, and you will see by watching them how their mannerisms are very similar. And when they talk about themselves, you'll find out how their interests are similar, which is very interesting. There have been all kinds of identical twin studies done over the last 100 years, I would say. So those are very interesting. Also, for your viewing pleasure, I will put a link and a trailer to a movie called The Bad Seed from the 1950s, 1956. Woohoo, that was a good year. That was the year I was born. Anyway, I'll put a trailer for this very old movie, but through the whole movie, there's a little girl who is basically a psychopath. Yeah, there are children who are psychopathic. And the debate through the whole thing is the mother trying to figure out whether it was the genetics of this child that made her the way she was, or whether it was her environment, because she was brought up in a very nice, decent, loving home. So there's this debate, and the different characters in the movie talk about this. And so it's interesting to watch, especially from the 1950s. It will show you how we were thinking about this even back then. So if you have time, you can look on YouTube. It's on YouTube, and you can watch it. It's awesome. It's really one of my favorite movies because it's so interesting to think about. Anyway. All right, the importance of sexual reproduction. I wanted to mention this. Everybody who looks at this probably knows that this is the Duggar family. And I don't know, what's the TV show that they're on, 19 Accounting or something. They have a lot of kids. So the reason that I put this up here is to explain to you the importance of sexual reproduction. We have two parents, and these two parents made 19 or 20 kids, however many they made. But the thing is that all of the children are different from each other. And you're thinking, well, man, how many different combinations could there be between these two parents? This man and this woman produced all of these children, but they are all different. So here's how it works. Because we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, each pair can line up different ways at the equator of the nucleus when meiosis is taking place. And this means that for every human woman, there are 8 million, it's actually over 8 million different combinations of the way that those pairs of chromosomes line up. So you have the ability to make over 8 million different types of eggs if you are female. The same is true for the male. Over 8 million different combinations of his chromosomes from his parents to produce different types of sperm cells. And so when you put those two together, 8 million times 8 million, that is just an astronomical number of combinations. And that's why all these kids are different from each other. Now, I want to say they look different from each other, but there is something else that's really important. It's not just their looks, it's their biochemistry too. It's the way that their immune systems work. It's all of their characteristics are different from each other. They have different combinations. I'll give you an example of biochemistry. So my sister and I look a lot alike. We have a lot of the same interests. We both love nature photography and all that sort of thing. In fact, that picture back there behind me of the dolphins that are jumping, my sister was standing right beside me and she was going, and I turned and looked and took the pictures. So anyway, we have a lot of the same interests, but we have some different biochemistry. We got into a discussion about cilantro while we were cooking Thanksgiving dinner together. She hates cilantro because it tastes like soap to her. I love cilantro because it gives a great flavor to foods. A totally different biochemical receptor is going on here in our bodies, even though we have so much of ourselves that are alike. So your biochemistry is different. And that means your susceptibility to infections is different. Your reactions to stressors are different. That's the importance of sexual reproduction. to make different types of offspring in the hopes, this is just biologically, this is not conscious, in the hopes that some of the individuals that are produced, some of the offspring will have the ability to survive. That's the importance of sexual reproduction. You make lots and lots of different types of offspring so that some of them will survive. Okay, and lastly, I want to mention biodiversity. Biodiversity is differences, right? Diversity in some part of biology. So you can talk about biodiversity on a genetic level. If you take the population of cheetahs around the world, they are so genetically identical that one disease can come along and wipe them all out because there's just not enough biodiversity in that particular species. You can have biodiversity of species. So if you look at an ecosystem, you want to see all different species of insects and amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals and plants and mosses and all of that. You want biodiversity because each one of those organisms fills a niche or a role in that particular ecosystem. That means that your ecosystem is healthy. You can have ecological and ecosystem biodiversity. How many different ecosystems are there in an area? Because I love the beach, I like to think about that. There are wooded areas, there are marsh areas, there are estuaries, there's the pelagic ocean, which is the open ocean. There are just so many different ecosystems that are present in that one area that are vital to the health of the whole. So biodiversity is terribly important. How do we have biodiversity? Because of differences in organisms. A lot of that comes about because of sexual reproduction. So this is a really important week, especially for those of you who are environmental science majors. Biodiversity, of course, is a tremendously important topic in environmental science. So I hope you get a lot out of this week, all the way from the genetics to the biodiversity, because they're all connected. And as always, if you need anything, please email me, m.sigmon@snhu.edu. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and please let me know if you need anything.